So yeah, I'm going to be talking about how to actually choose a study to replicate. Obviously, literature is huge. There are many, many studies in every field. Replications are comparatively rare. So there's lots of choice. And I'll talk about four lenses, four aspects you might want to consider. One is maybe an unrealistically impartial one, but just replication value. How important is it for this finding to be replicated? I think a very important one is really personal motivation. Why do I care to replicate a study? It's not yet the most incentivized scientific activity, so there needs to be some real motivation. And then obviously replications can be hard, so feasibility is another aspect. And then finally, has someone replicated already? Obviously, a single replication isn't enough to conclusively answer a question, but replications should then at least be cumulative. And I'll be going through these in turn and just try to share some practical thoughts on what each of these might mean. So replication value, there was recently a really interesting discussion in meta-psychology that started with a proposition to quantify replication value, very simply and a slightly scary looking formula, but essentially just saying, well, we care about two things. We care about value and uncertainty. Now, value, we can take citations as a proxy, very problematic proxy, but still a somewhat reasonable proxy. People generally tend to cite things they find valuable to their work, so things that are cited a lot are just scientifically more influential. Uncertainty, also really difficult to quantify, and the suggestion was, well, let's take a very simple proxy again, the inverse square root of the sample size, which is essentially just the variance of an estimate. So Isager and colleagues published this and said, well, that leads us into this sort of four-step workflow. We need some list of replication targets that we need to curate. Might be a whole discipline, might be your specific subject area. Then in there, let's calculate replication value, inspect, and select. Now, sometimes that would lead us to the right targets. So Baumeister, for example, had a very widely cited study on ego depletion with a very small sample. So this would get a very high replication value. And then a large registered replication report found that the effect at least didn't replicate very easily. So here, replication value would have led us to a really useful replication. But obviously, there are problems with both sides of the equation. Citations aren't the only pathway to impact, and some of the critiques pointed this out. So, for example, growth mindset had a lot of academic impact, but also a lot of non-academic impact. And clearly, if lots of schools get excited, reshape curricula for an intervention, that's a really good reason to test whether it's real. And also, there is this issue around citation counts being biased towards people who are well-known, highly resourced. Now, I'm not sure if that's necessarily an argument not to replicate their work, because it in fact shows that their work is more influential, but there are definitely equity issues around there that are interesting to discuss. Now, the sample size problems are actually even more fundamental. So for one, in fields that have large sample sizes, this just collapses. There's just no difference then anymore, whether you have 1,000, 2,000. So this is really helpful for small sample sizes. While actually there might be a huge need to replicate work in these large sample secondary data sets. We're currently working on a funding application exactly around this, but essentially saying, well, p-hacking is very easy when you just have a lot of data to play around with. But the formula would rank these relatively low. And obviously there's some small n fields that use repeated measures, where then the uncertainty estimate would be far too high. If I can have reliable results by testing 5 people's perceptions hundreds of times, clearly I don't need to have a lot of uncertainty. But some of this can just be fixed by you being mindful about your specific field. So if you are interested in psychophysics, maybe it's the number of observations and not the sample size that gives more insightful uncertainty estimates. But also, there's just a question whether we need to care that much about replication value as an abstract thing. So Feldman, in a response, said if it was valuable enough to publish, it's valuable enough to replicate. Now, on some level, you might say that's a bit naive. Clearly, we still need to prioritize among the many possible targets. But I think on some level, it's also very real. Someone thought this was valuable to write. A couple of reviewers thought it was valuable to publish. So that's a good justification to say you find it valuable to replicate. And obviously, we have replication rates of at most 1%. So there's a lot of there are a lot of opportunities to choose. And when you look at the meta-psychology discussion, the one big consensus in the end was this shouldn't be a gatekeeping tool. It is an offering to help people prioritize, but there can be lots of other reasons. It certainly shouldn't be a reason to reject replications. But that's sort of lens one. What would objectively, dispassionately, maybe be the most important targets? I think a very important other lens is just personal motivation. Why would you want to replicate? One common idea is to replicate foundational research before you try building on it. So I think there are many initiatives to try to get PhD students to start with a replication, partly because that helps them to figure out whether something is worth building on, but also because it helps them to develop skills in their particular research area. And that's something that can be relevant for everyone. And it's an easier way, it's not an easy way, but it's easier to publish in a field if you do a replication study than if you have no expertise yet and try to contribute novel insights. So for example here, Wagenmaker's reanalysis, now a reproduction, admittedly not a replication of them, certainly wasn't because they thought that precognition was the most important claim to replicate, but it was because it allowed to pursue a different personal motivation, which in this case was to promote Bayesian statistics. Now, a personal example from me was the computational replication of a model on diversity effects in teams. Difficult to quantify the replication value of computational work since there is no sample size. I think this would have ranked relatively high on a reasonable list, but my reason for doing it was purely personal. I wanted to learn agent-based modeling, and I wanted to enter this research area. And it led to an interesting publication, adding a lot of nuance to the previous findings, and published in one of the replication-focused journals. So just a second lens. What do you care about? What do you want to get out of doing a replication at this particular stage? Third lens around feasibility is one that comes with tensions. Because one thing that makes replications very feasible is to have open materials and open code. Now, that also makes it less likely that the original finding is very weak. So there's a fair bit of research suggesting that open code predicts reproducibility, which is the starting point for replicability. So yes, it's really helpful if you have full materials to build on, but maybe that also makes it a little bit too easy. Now, technical requirements are more real. If you don't have access to an expensive lab, replicating fMRI research is going to be difficult. And also, if you don't have access to a specific population, doing a faithful replication can become really difficult. Expertise is the third one, and there have been very interesting debates around the importance of expertise. For example, in priming research, does it need a special experimental touch to achieve these effects? Should people who don't have that touch even try? So I think the expertise is the most problematic one because it's not very tangible and we can all learn. But there are aspects to think about. And I already mentioned what I see as the trade-off there. So easy targets aren't always the best targets. Most replication studies are online survey experiments. And many are based on very transparent studies that might actually need less scrutiny than less transparent studies. It's really easy to replicate a brief online survey, but are they the most important in the real world? Are they actually the study designs that we want to keep on promoting? I'm less sure. So a harder finding to replicate was Struck's finding on the facial feedback effect. So the pen and mouth, does it make us smile if we are essentially forced into smiling? Now, that at least takes more resources to replicate. But especially the second large-scale attempt to replicate it, this Many Smiles collaboration, yielded very interesting results. So showing, well, there might be a real effect, there might be interesting moderators where we can really advance theory, but that only works because they weren't too swayed by what's easy to replicate. So yes, feasibility is an important lens. I think it's the riskiest of the four. And then finally, and that's something where some of the projects Luke and I have been working on directly come in, is this question, has something already been replicated? Because if there is a conclusive answer, there is just no point in replicating something again. For example, in our database, we have quite a lot of replications of Ash's line experiments, so this very early conformity work that replicates. We know that it replicates. Probably not the best thing to try yet again. So if we already have direct replications, or even better, registered replication reports, that's great. If we have meta-analyses that try very hard and don't find effects, then that's probably also the moment when we don't need to replicate yet again. Now here, the opposite clearly doesn't apply. We know fields where meta-analyses show quite attractive effects and direct replications still fail. That's the same with conceptual replications. So them conceptually replicated precognition findings in the study, I think 5 times, 6 times, I don't remember how many studies were in the paper. That doesn't predict replication success. But if there have been independent direct replications, that's worth knowing about. And obviously, beyond deciding whether it's worth replicating, this can help us figure out how to replicate. And we've been working for a long time on a replication database, originally a couple of different databases that are now coming together that catalog a lot of replication attempts and that are worth having a look at. Now, what does it look like to have a look at these? There are a couple of different ways. One is the Flora annotator, and that's basically a web app where you can upload any list of references and just get an overview over which of these have been replicated, and at a very coarse level, how the authors interpreted the results. So that can be helpful if you have a list of studies in a field and just want to see out of those which are not replicated yet, where might we have mixed findings. That's maybe a good starting point as well. And also it's a tool that we're trying to promote for just checking reading lists before you teach, findings that fail replication, reference lists before you submit manuscripts that build on non-replicable findings. So it's essentially a reference list checker. Another tool called the Thread Explorer offers more details into a smaller set of replications, but this has fully coded effect sizes. So this chart might look familiar to you, even though it's small. It's basically what the Open Science Collaboration published 11 years ago in their replicability assessments. But here we can look at things like effect size shrinkage. And I said for priming, it's up to the poster child of a field where there are many replications that have essentially destroyed most of the original findings. But you might use this to just see what's going on in a broader field you're interested in. And getting a sense of typical effect size shrinkage, so how the replication effect sizes compare to original effect sizes, can help with things like sample size planning. We expect effects to be much smaller and still care about precision. We might need larger samples for the replication, for instance. So this can be helpful to just explore in a broader field if there are any replications, and then where you might be able to build on. A third tool that we are releasing essentially today is a plugin for Zotero. Don't have a screenshot in here yet. That allows to scan a full library for replication attempts. Now that's obviously the most custom approach, where you see what has been replicated in the full data set that you base your research on. So how does this all come together? In wrapping up, certainly makes sense to just broadly look at candidates that you might be interested in replicating. It makes sense to early on see what has been replicated in the space already, to then either deprioritize those or actually build on what has come before. To evaluate candidates, I think it's interesting to look at replication value with the original formula, but at least sort of broadly be inspired by that. Think about feasibility and motivation. Something that's really helpful is to reproduce as much of the original analysis as possible. So if you have open data and open code, definitely reproduce that. But even if you don't, with some creativity, there are many things you can just do, for example, from correlation tables, and see if I have these correlations, can I reproduce the linear regression results? So just actually see, does this data make sense, and do I understand how this data fits together? Because if it really doesn't, maybe there are more fundamental questions that need to be answered before doing a replication. And then finally, commit, pre-register, and do the replication, or submit a registered report, which is probably even better. Couple of key takeaways. So while there are really nice formulas, they clearly don't provide definitive answer. I think replications are a very real chance for all of us to develop, maybe not our CVs quite as much as actually our skills and our understanding of fields, and reproduction is really important. As for any research project, the best project is one that's actually done. So it makes sense to pick something that's motivating and as feasible as it needs to be. With that, thank you very much. I look forward to any questions, any discussion.